When I returned from Kandahar with a Purple Heart on my chest, my own family couldn't even pretend to be proud. At the dinner table that was supposed to celebrate my homecoming, my mother barely glanced at my medal before calling it some minor scratch from training. My father didn't even bother to look up. "Brandon," he said in that cold voice I knew so well, "you've always been the family disappointment." What none of them knew was that in just 3 days, that so-called scratch would be honored by the president himself at the White House. I'm Brandon Carter, 28 years old, a corporal in the United States Marine Corps. Most people look at my uniform and assume I enlisted out of family tradition or love of country. The truth is much simpler. I enlisted to survive. My story doesn't start with some patriotic awakening. It starts with a failing grade glowing red on a computer screen. It starts 9 years ago, with the moment I decided to run. I was 19, and my world smelled of burnt coffee and failure. I sat in the sterile silence of my dorm room at a California State University. The cinder block walls, a constant gray reminder that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. On my laptop screen, a single glowing red F in organic chemistry wasn't just a grade. It was a verdict. It was the class my parents had chosen, a non-negotiable step on the path to the medical career they had meticulously mapped out for me. The phone rang, its shrillness an intrusion on my private shame. I knew who it was. My mother's voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was the weary, calculated tone of a CEO assessing a portfolio of losing stocks. "Brandon," she began, the sigh preceding her words. "We invested so much. The science camps, the private tutors. I just don't understand why you can't apply yourself. Your brother Trevor, he never put us through this kind of public disappointment." She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what was wrong. She was simply auditing a failed asset. And the unspoken conclusion hung in the air. I was the bad investment. The feeling of being trapped, of suffocating in a life that felt like a costume, tightened its grip around my chest. I was a Carter, and in our world, Carters didn't fail. They went to Yale or Stanford. They didn't get Fs at a state school. The next day, I wandered aimlessly across campus, a ghost in a sea of students who all seemed to be striding toward a future. That's when I saw it. A small, unassuming fold-out table with a banner that read, U.S. Marine Corps, the few, the proud. Behind it sat a man whose presence was anything but unassuming. Gunnery Sergeant Rivera was a Hispanic man with a ramrod-straight posture and a steady gaze that seemed to see right through my carefully constructed facade. He wasn't selling glory or spouting patriotic cliches. He was talking about something I'd never had. Purpose. "We're not looking for the 4.0 students," he said to a small group. But his eyes for a brief electric moment met mine. "We're looking for the ones who don't quit when that F shows up on the screen. We don't need you to be perfect. We need you to be resilient." The word hit me like a physical force. For the first time in my 19 years, I felt seen. Not as a son who had failed, not as a student with a poor GPA, but as someone whose grit, the only thing I truly owned, might actually be a valuable currency. It wasn't a promise of an easy life. It was a challenge. And it was a challenge I was suddenly desperately hungry to accept. That Sunday, I announced my decision over dinner. The scene was a perfect portrait of my family's world in their Beverly Hills home. My mother, Eleanor, slicing a perfectly pink roast beef. My father, Dr. Edward Carter, decanting an expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. My words, "I'm enlisting in the Marine Corps," fell into the room and shattered the crystal-clear tranquility. The gentle clinking of silverware stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, punctuated only by the solemn ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. a clock that measured time in generations of academic achievement. My father carefully placed his silver fork on his plate. He dabbed his lips with a starched linen napkin, his movements slow and deliberate, a performance of intellectual superiority. He did not look at me. He looked at my mother, his voice as calm and cutting as a surgeon's scalpel. "Eleanor, you see, this is what happens when we are too lenient. The military. It's the last refuge for those with no other options." The words were a calculated assassination of my newfound hope. But Trevor's reaction was the final twisting of the knife. He let out a short, barking laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. "That's rich. My little brother is going to play G.I. Joe. Just try not to get your uniform dirty, Brandon." In their eyes, I wasn't choosing a path of service. I was choosing shame. I wasn't reaching for a purpose. I was admitting defeat. 2 weeks later, I sat in a recruitment office, the pen heavy in my hand. With each deliberate letter of my signature, I wasn't just enlisting in the Marine Corps. I was severing the invisible, suffocating strings they had used to control me my entire life. They thought I was running away from failure, but they didn't know I was running toward the only purpose that had ever felt real. I understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating that I would have to walk that path alone. The purpose I was running toward wasn't born in that sterile recruitment office. It had taken root years earlier on quiet Saturday afternoons. These were hours spent in the one place in my family's world where I felt I could breathe, my grandfather's garage. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess, a sanctuary that smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and old, honorable secrets. To my parents, he was a quiet carpenter, a retired Marine who didn't quite fit into their polished, intellectual circle. He was a relic from a different, less refined world. But to me, he was an oracle, and he never spoke of the medals I knew he kept in a locked footlocker under his workbench. His pride wasn't in what he had been given, but in what he had done. He'd let me sit on an old wooden stool, the scent of fresh-cut pine in the air, while he showed me his real trophy, a faded olive-drab canvas medic bag from his service in Vietnam. Its buckles were worn smooth, its fabric frayed from use. He'd point to a dark, rust-colored stain on one of the gauze pockets, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "That right there," he'd say, his calloused finger gently tracing the edge of the stain. "That's from Corporal Johnson. Took a piece of shrapnel to the chest near Khe Sanh. Held his heart in my hands for 20 minutes, keeping it beating until the dust-off chopper arrived. He'd look at me then, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky, clear and steady. 'Saving a life, Brandon,' he'd say, the words landing with a profound gravity. It has a weight to it, a weight no diploma on a wall can ever match. That was the legacy I wanted to inherit. His, not theirs. His garage was the absolute antithesis of my parents' living room, a pristine, silent space where I always felt more like a visitor on a museum tour than a son. The centerpiece of that room, the altar at which my family worshipped, was the grand fireplace. The wall above it was what my mother proudly called the Carter Legacy. It was a shrine to academic and financial success. My father's history PhD from Stanford, framed in heavy mahogany. My mother's genetics PhD from Yale, its identical twin. And there in the center, given the most prominent position, was a framed article from Forbes magazine detailing my brother Trevor's multi-million-dollar tech startup. Every certificate, every accolade was perfectly aligned, a testament to a bloodline of intellectual achievement from which I felt utterly disconnected. I was 14 when I won the district championship for cross-country running. I came home breathless and exhilarated, clutching my gold medal. My mother looked at it with a thin, polite smile, the kind you'd offer a neighbor's child showing you a crayon drawing. "That's nice, dear," she said, already turning back to her laptop. "But running won't get you into medical school. Maybe you should focus more on your chemistry." My father didn't even look up from his journal. "Extracurriculars are fine, Brandon. But let's not lose sight of the real prize." The trophy got placed on a dusty shelf in my bedroom, unseen and uncelebrated. Years later, after boot camp, after earning my place among Marines, I would realize that small moment, the feeling of my achievement being dismissed, planted the first seed of my escape. Boot camp at Parris Island was designed to break you. And it did. The humidity was a living thing that clung to your skin, filling your lungs with swamp air. We were woken at 4 a.m. and pushed until midnight. They stripped away everything you thought you were and rebuilt you from the ground up. It was during the crucible, the final 54-hour test of endurance, that I was nearly crushed for good. We were on a 10-mile forced march, full packs, rifles, carrying our share of a 200-pound stretcher. The sand fleas were relentless, biting at every inch of exposed skin, and my legs felt like they were filled with molten lead. I stumbled, my knee buckling on a hidden root, and went down hard. Exhaustion and despair crashed over me like a wave. A voice in my head, one that sounded terrifyingly like my father's, whispered, "You're not cut out for this." That's when I saw a hand reach down in front of my face. It belonged to Private First Class Maria Reyes, a former soccer star from El Paso who was built like a welded spring. Her face was as drawn and exhausted as mine, but her grip was iron. "Get up, Carter," she said, her voice a low rasp. "We don't leave anyone behind. We either cross that line together or not at all." I grabbed her hand and I got up. We crossed that finish line together. And in that moment, I understood. The strength my parents worshipped, the kind that came from solitary genius and individual achievement, was nothing compared to the strength of a team. That was the lesson Parris Island taught me. No one succeeds alone. The Marines you bleed beside become something more than family. They become a part of you. After boot camp, I pursued my true calling. I volunteered for Field Medical Training Battalion and became a hospital corpsman, the Navy's combat medic embedded with Marine units. While other Marines trained for combat, I trained to save the lives of those who fought. It felt like my grandfather's legacy being passed down. My first deployment was to Helmand Province, Afghanistan, a desolate, war-torn landscape. My first real test came on a routine patrol when an IED buried in the roadside detonated, ripping through our lead Humvee. I moved on autopilot, my training taking over. I found Private Jenkins pinned under the wreckage, his leg a mess of bone and shredded muscle. As enemy fire crackled overhead, I applied a tourniquet with hands that somehow remained steady, started a fielder, and kept talking to him, telling him about his family, about the cold beer waiting for him back at base, anything to keep the light in his eyes from fading. The medevac arrived 22 minutes later. Jenkins survived. He lost the leg below the knee, but he went home to his wife and newborn son. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Hayes, put a hand on my shoulder after the dust off chopper disappeared into the sky. "That was solid work, Corpsman," he said. "The lives you save in this hellhole will be the medals that matter." I didn't feel like a disappointment of any family in that moment. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Every few weeks in Afghanistan, we were allowed to call home. My calls with my parents were strained, formal affairs, a ritual both sides seemed to endure rather than enjoy. They never asked about my work. They asked when my contract was up. They asked if I was thinking about my future, their way of saying a real career. But I remember one call, about 8 months into my deployment. My mother asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Have you ever thought about what you're really doing there, Brandon?" For a moment, I thought she was finally ready to understand. I told her about Jenkins, about holding his femoral artery shut while calling in the medevac. I told her about the weight of a life in my hands. There was a long pause on the line. Her response was quiet, almost sad. "That sounds very traumatic, honey. But that's exactly why we wanted something more stable for you. You're throwing away your potential on other people's wars." I felt the familiar sting, the subtle knife twist. Even my moment of saving a life had been reframed as a failure to protect myself. I ended the call a few minutes later, and I didn't try to explain myself again for a very long time. In the fall of my second year of deployment, our unit was tasked with a mission in Kandahar province, a dangerous region held by the Taliban. We were there to advise and assist an Afghan National Army checkpoint that had been under increasing fire. I was attached to a 12-man squad, led by a sergeant I would come to trust with my life, Sergeant Marcus Thompson. He was a towering man with a calm, steady demeanor and a voice that could cut through chaos. He called me Doc and treated me with the quiet respect reserved for those who had proven themselves under fire. For weeks, we ran patrols, trained local medics, and tried to establish a foothold of order in a landscape of chaos. I was learning a new kind of medicine, one where my operating room was a mud brick wall, and my anesthesia was a stern word and a leather strap to bite down on. But the mission was about to take a terrible turn. It was in March, 3 months before I would come home. We were on a morning patrol through a small village, meeting with local elders. The day was deceptively peaceful, the sky a perfect empty blue. I remember Sergeant Thompson making a joke about the coffee back at base. Then the world erupted. The first RPG hit the wall behind us, showering us with rock and debris. Within seconds, we were caught in a coordinated ambush, enemy fire raining down from rooftops and alleyways. We were pinned. I saw 2 of my brothers fall in the first volley, Lance Corporal Jennings and Private Diaz. I didn't think. I moved. Dragging my medical bag, I sprinted toward Diaz, who was clutching his abdomen, his blood already soaking the dust beneath him. I worked on him first, packing the wound, fighting to keep the life from spilling out of him. Then I turned to Jennings, whose shoulder had been torn open. As I was applying a tourniquet, I felt a searing, blinding heat tear through my own leg and side. I'd been hit. I looked down to see my uniform turning dark and wet. For a moment, the world went white. Shock tried to drag me under, but my grandfather's voice echoed in my head. "The medic is the last one to go down." I bit down on my cheek until I tasted blood, and I kept working. I finished the tourniquet on Jennings. I called in the medevac. And then, only then, did I allow myself to fall. I woke up in a military hospital in Germany, a tube down my throat and a throbbing fire in my side and leg. Over the following days, I learned the extent of the damage. A bullet had fractured my femur, and another had grazed my kidney. I would have a permanent limp, but I would walk. Diaz and Jennings were alive. They would make it. Sergeant Thompson came to see me. He sat in the hard plastic chair beside my bed, his eyes red-rimmed. "You ran into that firefight, Doc," he said, his voice hoarse. "You didn't run for cover. You ran toward them. That's why they're alive. That's why you got the Navy Cross." The Navy Cross. The second highest award for valor in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. I stared at him, not fully comprehending. He gripped my hand, the hand that had held so many lives. "You earned it," he said. "Every bit of it." 3 months after being shot down in Kandahar, I flew home, my legs still weak, my body still healing. The Purple Heart was pinned to my chest, but the Navy Cross ceremony was scheduled for something far grander, a presentation by the President at the White House. My family, as I mentioned, didn't know. When I landed in LA, my parents had arranged a small dinner, a welcome home that felt more like an obligation. The scene was a familiar stage. My mother had prepared roast beef, my father had decanted his wine, and Trevor, true to form, had shown up with a condescending smirk. I was not prepared for the ambush of a different kind. As we sat down to eat, my mother sighed, her eyes scanning my uniform with a mixture of distaste and pity. "We're just glad you got that out of your system, Brandon. Now we can finally talk about your real future. Maybe go back to school for your MBA. I gripped my fork so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't respond. Then my father chimed in, gesturing to my Purple Heart with his wine glass. "So this little scratch from a training exercise, that's what you have to show for 4 years of playing soldier?" The dismissal was so casual, so complete, it stole the breath from my lungs. And Trevor, of course, had to add his own commentary. "Honestly, Brandon," he said, leaning back in his chair, "even that medal looks kinda sad. I've seen better ones at antique stores." The table laughed. My mother, my father, they chuckled at his wit. I sat there, the ghost of my grandfather sitting beside me, and I felt a cold, hard peace settle in my chest. I took one slow, deliberate breath. I set down my fork, and I spoke. This little scratch was a bullet that shattered my femur, and another that nearly took out my kidney. I got it while running into enemy fire to save 2 fellow Marines, both of whom are alive today, because of what I did. And in 3 days, I will be standing in the White House, receiving the Navy Cross from the President of the United States. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You are all invited. But frankly, I don't care if you come." I walked out without looking back. The silence I left behind was deafening. 3 days later, I stood in the East Room of the White House. The room gleamed with historic grandeur, chandeliers casting a warm light on a sea of dignitaries, generals, and members of Congress. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. My family was there. I had seen them slip into the back of the room, their faces a portrait of stunned humility. They looked small, out of place among the titans of military and political power. My mother was clutching a handkerchief, her eyes already red. The president stepped forward, and the room fell silent. The citation was read aloud, every detail of that day in Kandahar laid bare for the world to hear. How I had run toward the enemy. How I had saved my fellow Marines. How I had continued to provide medical aid even after being shot twice. The words echoed through the room. And when the heavy weight of the Navy Cross was pinned to my chest, I looked out at the audience. The generals, the senators, the fellow service members. They were all looking at me with profound respect. But I wasn't looking for their approval. I was looking at my family, and for the first time in my life, I saw them clearly. I saw my mother, tears streaming down her face, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling before her eyes. I saw my father, standing rigid, his expression unreadable, but his hands trembling. And I saw Trevor, his smug confidence evaporated, replaced by something I had never seen from him before. Shame. The applause that followed was thunderous, but I barely heard it. The vindication I had chased for so long, the acceptance I had craved, suddenly felt like a distant memory. I had already won. I had proven my worth not to them, but to myself. And that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. After the ceremony, a moment occurred that sealed the truth of my journey. Sergeant Thompson made his way through the crowd and stood at my shoulder, a gesture of unwavering solidarity. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Trevor, his eyes hard as flint. "Every single word is true," he said, his voice low and firm. I was there. I watched your brother crawl through hell to save my life and the lives of my men." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "He is the finest Marine I have ever had the honor of serving with." My family stared, speechless. The truth delivered by a man who embodied the very honor they had never understood was undeniable. They had no response. That night, back in my quiet hotel room in D.C., the apologies began. The first call was from Trevor. The condescending, mocking tone I had known my entire life was gone, replaced by a strained, choked voice. "Brandon, I am so sorry," he stammered. "I've been an arrogant ass. I had no idea. I never understood." It was the first honest thing he had ever said to me. A few minutes later, my mother called, her words punctuated by racking sobs. She was sorry. So deeply sorry. So ashamed. She went on and on about how she had failed me, how she wished she could take it all back. I listened, a strange detachment settling over me. Their apologies, while seemingly sincere, felt like trying to patch a bullet hole with a Band-Aid. They couldn't erase the years of calculated indifference, the lonely nights in Afghanistan, or the raw humiliation of that last dinner. The wound was too deep. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke, my voice calm and clear. "I need time." I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't offer absolution. I simply drew a line in the sand, a boundary for my own sanity. A week later, my father came to see me at my small, temporary apartment in Washington, D.C. He looked out of place, a titan of academia adrift in my simple government-issued living room. He didn't offer a tearful apology like my mother, or a raw confession like my brother. That wasn't his way. He just stood there for a long time, looking at the Navy Cross, which I had placed on the mantelpiece. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, analytical. That day at the White House, he began still staring at the medal. I watched the generals, the senators, the president. I saw the way they looked at you. He turned to face me, and his eyes held a strange mixture of awe and defeat. They looked at you with respect, a deep-earned respect. He shook his head slowly. "I've been in academia for 40 years. I've published a dozen books. I have never, not once, commanded that kind of respect." It was the only way he knew how to say it. It wasn't an apology for a lack of love, but a concession of status. He was acknowledging that my currency, courage, honor, sacrifice, was in this new world worth more than his. In that moment, I realized something profound. His respect, which I had once so desperately coveted, no longer mattered. I didn't need his love or his approval to know my own value. I had earned my own, and they had started to change. It was true. Their world had been shaken, their certainties shattered. But as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, I was left with a question that had no easy answer. Could a relationship rebuilt from the ashes of regret and shame ever be truly whole? And more importantly, after everything I had been through, after everything I had become, did I even need it to be? That question followed me as I began to walk into the first chapter of my new life. My new life is quiet. It unfolds not under the harsh sun of Afghanistan, but under the thoughtful fluorescent lights of a classroom at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Today, I am an instructor. I train the next generation of Navy corpsmen and Army combat medics. My students are young, eager, and terrified, just as I once was. But I don't teach them from a textbook. I teach them from my scars. The slight permanent limp in my walk is a constant lesson in the cost of survival. I stand before them, not as a hero, but as a testament. A medal on your chest doesn't make you a medic, I tell them, my voice steady. What makes you a medic is the willingness to run toward the sound of the wounded when everyone else is running away. In their eyes, I don't see the judgment I once knew. I see respect here. I am not the disappointment of the Carter family. I am Corporal Carter, a survivor. My legacy isn't written in a Forbes article. It's written in the lives I saved, and now in the lives I am preparing to save others. This is a weight I am proud to carry. My family, in their own way, has been trying to understand that weight. The change hasn't been miraculous, but it has been real. Trevor, in a move that shocked me most, began volunteering his weekends at a legal aid clinic for veterans. He calls me sometimes, asking questions, trying to comprehend the world he so casually dismissed. My mother sends care packages filled not with medical school catalogs, but with thick wool socks, good coffee, and books she thinks I'll enjoy. During a recent visit home, I saw that she had cleared a prominent space on the living room bookshelf, right where my lonely trophy once collected dust. In its place now stood a glass display case. Inside, my Navy Cross and Purple Heart lay on a bed of dark blue velvet. Beside them was a single faded photograph of my team in Kandahar, smiling and covered in dust. My mother saw me looking at it. "I should have honored your service long ago," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion I wasn't used to hearing from her. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time." I accepted these gestures, these fragile olive branches, but with a quiet, protective distance. A wound can heal, but the scar tissue remains, a permanent reminder of the injury. We even went to family therapy, a step I took with deep reluctance. It was there, in the sterile quiet of a therapist's office, that the final truth came out. My mother, through tears, confessed her terror of receiving a knock on the door from 2 Marines in dress uniform. My father, in his analytical way, admitted his fear that I would end up like my grandfather, a man he respected, but also pitied, for the quiet, invisible wounds he carried home from his war. Their fear had manifested as anger and disappointment. Their desire to protect me had twisted into a need to control me. I understood it on an intellectual level, but understanding is not the same as absolution. Their fear didn't excuse the pain they had caused. Looking at them in that room, stripped of their academic and financial armor, looking simply like 2 aging, regretful parents, I had a final, profound realization. The presidential ceremony, the medals, the public vindication, they hadn't been the moment of my liberation. I had freed myself long before that. I freed myself in the mud of Paris Island when I chose to stand up on my own. I freed myself under fire in Afghanistan when I chose to run toward my brothers in arms. And I freed myself in their dining room when I finally chose my own truth over their approval. My value was never theirs to give. It was always there inside me, forged in hardship, waiting for me to be the one to finally recognize it. My journey was never about winning their acceptance. It was about finding my own. Now, when I look to the future, I no longer see their shadow looming over me. I see a clear and open road. I see the sunrise. Thank you for walking this path with me. My story is one of finding my own sunrise, and I know so many of you have had to find yours too. Your journey, your resilience, deserves to be honored. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels and connecting with all of you from around the world. And if this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support means everything to me.